Russia is in deep trouble. As its war in Ukraine drags on, its biggest neighbor, China, is circling. And while the relationship between these two nations may seem stable on the surface, many analysts believe these two allies could become enemies within the next decade, even potentially finding themselves in a massive, hot war. Over the last few months, reports of disagreements between Russia and China over trade and military support have emerged, showing that serious cracks are beginning to form in their supposedly no-limits partnership. These cracks are bigger than many people realize, including severe economic concessions and even territorial concessions, with Russia conceding some long-disputed territory to Chinese control, something Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin would prefer that you didn't know about. But these aren't the only tensions between the two nations. Russia and China have always been uneasy friends, and historically, they have more often been enemies than they've been allies, with massive border disputes that are still unsettled, and with each nation desiring the leadership position in their region of the world. For the time being, they have entered into an alliance of convenience, with aligned interests and common geopolitical opponents. But now, with the Russian military stretched extremely thin in Ukraine and international sanctions squeezing the Russian economy, Russia is more vulnerable than ever, making this the perfect moment for China to make a potential move on long-standing grievances, especially if they conclude that Russia is no longer useful as a strong military ally. Several prominent geopolitical analysts have considered this, and are now predicting that China could make a calculated decision within the next few years, taking advantage of Russia's depleted military forces and newly weakened international position to gain a strategic geopolitical advantage. If China decides to exploit Russia's weakened state, the consequences could be felt far beyond the immediate region. A conflict between these two nations could send shockwaves through global markets, potentially causing energy prices to skyrocket and throwing key alliances like NATO into disarray. Impacts that could hit closer to home than you might think, with most of the Western world still being highly dependent on Chinese trade for everyday goods and services. And this potential conflict could even usher in a new phase of warfare that future generations may evaluate as one of the opening chapters of World War III. But the question is, could this really happen? At first, the idea of Russia and China going to war probably sounds a little bit crazy, and that's something I recently believed as well. But there are a lot of historical precedents for this sort of thing, and apparently, according to the Kremlin's own records, Russia itself does not think this idea is at all crazy. Earlier this year, insightful Kremlin documents came to light, revealing that Russia has actually been preparing for a Chinese invasion of Siberia for at least the past 16 years. This is an invasion they anticipated might happen if Russia ever found themselves under the exact circumstances they now find themselves in today, revealing that Russia has long been anticipating exactly what we're now seeing. So what exactly did Russia predict in these documents? What does Russia know about their own security, or lack thereof, that we don't? And what has Russia been preparing for all these years when it comes to their relationship with China? The plans laid out by the Kremlin over a decade ago are very intriguing. They include war games that detail several worst-case scenarios in which one of Russia's powerful eastern allies could exploit tensions between Russia and the West. Russia predicted, at least as early as 2008, that if their coming conflict with Ukraine stretched its military thinner than expected, it would leave its eastern regions vulnerable to attack, and this would make Russia as a whole a prime target, since these are sparsely populated and resource-rich lands that China has historical claims to. This makes parts of Russia eerily subject to some of the same nationalist reunification rhetoric that China is currently pursuing concerning territories like Taiwan, except the Russian territories would actually be much easier for China to invade than Taiwan would. In particular, China has historical claims to the region of Outer Manchuria, where the Russian port of Vladivostok currently sits, housing the headquarters of Russia's Pacific Fleet. China ceded these lands to Russia under duress back in 1858, during their century of humiliation, and many believe that China still desires to return these historical lands back to their fold if they are ever presented with the right opportunity. Among that many is included, apparently, those working in Moscow for the Kremlin. These aren't mere Western talking points. Instead, these are actual scenarios that Russia has been preparing for at least 16 years. And as you'll see in this video, the precedents and first steps for each of these scenarios have ominously now actually occurred. That raises some interesting questions. First, are Russia's plans right, and would China actually invade Russia? Second, if China would invade, could they? And third, even if they wouldn't, what might China's mere ability to invade Russia, alongside their potential motive, mean for the future of the relationship between the two powers? In this video, we'll explore all three. And in particular, we'll realize how significant that third point really is. A potential invasion, of course, is the juiciest topic of them all. But it is a highly unlikely scenario, though admittedly not impossible. But what you'll realize today is that this doesn't necessarily matter, because a real invasion doesn't have to actually occur for it to have a very real impact on the future of our planet. And even the remote possibility of an invasion makes nations behave differently towards each other, creating real and fascinating results. These results have already occurred, regardless of whether a future Chinese invasion of Russia ever comes. And that makes this topic extremely interesting, even if you're starting as a skeptic, like myself. As we dive in, it's interesting to note that we are entering the land of eerie historical precedents, so these thoughts are far from mere speculation. Throughout history, major world powers have often become too greedy and too confident, and pushed too far, like the mythical character Icarus. Flying too close to the sun, their wings melt, as they open themselves up to attack by other nations who had become their temporary allies out of mere convenience or circumstance. As the saying goes, nations don't have allies. They have interests. The most obvious example in Russia's case is Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in World War II, where the Soviet Union was backstabbed after helping Germany accomplish their initial invasion and conquest of Europe. As the war broke out, the Soviets helped Germany in their invasion of Poland, and also occupied other territories like the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. A huge boon for their empire that also protected Nazi Germany's eastern flank while Hitler completed his occupations to the west. But when the Soviet Union appeared to be in a somewhat weakened state, their supposed ally turned on them, hoping to take them by surprise and claim the entire prize for themselves. And were it not for the support of other allied nations like the United States entering the war, dividing German forces, and providing the Soviets with huge quantities of equipment, the Soviets probably would have lost their empire to this act of betrayal. Nazi Germany, like modern China, wanted total dominance over their sphere of the world, and it turned out that they saw the Soviet Union as merely a means to that end, just as Russia today could merely be a means to China's end of weakening the West, at least from China's perspective. Because of their experiences in World War II, Russia has taken these historical lessons and reasonable fears into the way they view the outside world. Since then, Russia has never fully trusted their allies, knowing they could be backstabbed at any time. And right now, history appears to be repeating itself, or at least Russia is very nervous that it could. Russia has long anticipated this moment, and now, in an effort to stave off a potential Chinese invasion, Moscow has already begun making major concessions, giving China economic resources and even control over territory that could have a lasting impact on both nations' futures and on the broader world. We'll get into those major concessions in just a few minutes. But before that, to demonstrate that I'm not just blowing smoke, let's first turn again to look more in depth at Russia's war games against China that we mentioned before, because the details here are just too eerie to pass up. The Financial Times has published a summary of Russia's war plans for a Chinese invasion, with specific references to war games that Russia conducted in 2008 and 2014. If you know recent Russian history, you might be familiar with these dates, but if not to worry, because I'm about to tell you their significance. These were war games that took place to allow Russia to assess their risks as they prepared to invade Crimea and start what would eventually grow into their full-scale war with Ukraine. Getting more specific on the timelines, the first war games took place in 2008 as Russia was setting up their initial feasibility plans, and the second war games took place in 2014 as Russia prepared in earnest for the actual full-scale invasion of Crimea. It seems that Russia expected, wrongly, that their efforts might be resisted much more heavily than they actually were by the international community. It's common practice, after all, to prepare for any possibilities when you are literally going to war with another nation. And apparently, in the case of Russia's annexation of Crimea, Russia's greatest fear was that the invasion would go south, and that China would then swoop in to pick up the pieces. But while that anticipated international response may not have happened in reference to Crimea, to the West's shame, it did happen 8 years later when Russia invaded all of Ukraine in 2022, and the international community finally responded in force, throwing Vladimir Putin completely off his game. This makes Russia's war games especially relevant today, because they were constructed to prepare Russia for such a time as this. In one wargame scenario summarized by the Financial Times, Russia finds themselves unexpectedly at war with Desinya, a fictional nation to the east, which is obviously supposed to be China. Desinya has invaded Siberia and taken Russia by surprise, seeking to exploit any tensions between Russia and Western countries, despite on the surface publicly stating that they want to strengthen their ties with the Russian nation. That's exactly what China is doing today, claiming a no-limits partnership with Russia, the classic and well-documented ancient Chinese strategy called hide a dagger behind a smile. And this is also exactly what Nazi Germany did with the Soviet Union before betraying and invading them. Russia is right to be worried. In the war game, the conflict plays out in traditional Russian invasion style, except in this case, Russia is the one on the receiving end. First, China pays fake protesters to clash with police in Russia's Far East and create civil disunity and confusion. Then, as internal tensions are boiling over, Chinese saboteurs attack Russian security infrastructure and begin to eliminate key military targets leading up to an invasion. Then, eventually, a full-scale Chinese invasion begins, under the guise of protecting Chinese nationals living in Russia from genocide. Accusations that come due to actions that China itself was covertly responsible for. It's like a step-by-step playbook of what Russia did to Ukraine between 2014 and 2022, except this time, Russia was planning for their tactics to be used against them in Siberia. It's a scary scenario, and not just for Russia, desires for vengeance and justice over the war in Ukraine notwithstanding. If Siberia's resources were ever to fall into Chinese hands, this would cause shockwaves in the global energy market, likely bottling up resources worldwide and potentially opening up a much broader global war. But this was not the only scenario that Russia was preparing for. Another wargame scenario Russia prepared for was more general. In this wargame, instead of tensions with the West, the impetus for the war was a rise of new nationalist leaders in China, something of course that we could never see happening. Funnily enough, Russia conducted this wargame the year after Xi Jinping came to power as the new ultra-nationalist president of China. Just a coincidence there, I'm sure. This new nationalist government gives extra weight to Russia's fears, as it provides another reason for a potential Chinese invasion on top of the other one. In the wargame, these Chinese nationalist leaders decide to invade Kazakhstan and Siberia to gain more resources and living space for the huge Chinese population, a scenario reminiscent of what the Soviet Union experienced at the hands of Germany in World War II. In this wargame scenario, it was found that the only way to prevent Russian society from destabilizing and collapsing was to use limited tactical nukes against Chinese forces to slow their advances. Interestingly, this scenario was limited to the focused use of tactical nukes. Full-out nuclear war was not even considered as an option by Russia, even though that would have been consistent with so-called Russian nuclear doctrine, the same nuclear doctrine that Vladimir Putin always likes to point to scare the West away from intervening in Ukraine. Apparently though, even in circumstances such as a full-blown invasion by China, Russia isn't actually prepared to resort to total nuclear war. And Western politicians who fear nuclear war with Russia could learn a lot and gain a lot more confidence just by studying Russia's previous war games. But that's another video in and of itself. Instead, let's turn to a third wargame scenario Russia prepared for that is perhaps the eeriest of them all, because right now, the scenario it predicts is actually taking place. In this final wargame scenario, Desinya, the not-so-veiled fictional representation of China, demands a huge increase in raw energy imports at extremely low prices, presumably taking advantage of sanctions against Russia and their weakened geopolitical position. After Russia says no, Desinya, or China, then begins preparing for war. Crazy stuff. But how realistic are these scenarios? And how real is this risk for Russia? Well, let's just say that there's a reason that, as soon as Russia's invasion of Ukraine started to fail, Vladimir Putin began seeking out every opportunity he could find to shake the hand of China's president. Putin knew not just that he would need China's support to continue fighting, but also that there was a very real chance of China becoming an enemy if things went too far south. After all, he himself had been wargaming for exactly that. That brings us back then to the concessions that Russia has already been forced to make to China, likely to try to satiate them and take their minds off of more extreme possibilities. These concessions have come in several forms: economic concessions, diplomatic concessions, and, perhaps most surprisingly, territorial concessions. Yes, you heard me right. Let's start with the territorial concessions, since those are probably the most surprising of all. I'll keep this brief, since I already have a full video on this specific topic that you can watch later if you want to dive deeper, titled "China is already replacing Russia in Siberia." But as a result of their war with Ukraine, Russia has been forced to hand over half of an island on their border with China to full Chinese control. Bolshoi Ussuriysky Island, also known as the Great Ussuri Island. China claiming half of an island from Russia might not at first seem like a big deal. But this not only gives China control of this large island, it also gives them full control of the two major navigable rivers that the island sits at the conjunction of, a massive territorial concession. This, in turn, also gives China the ability to militarily threaten the largest inland city in the Russian Far East, Khabarovsk, along with an entire region known as Outer Manchuria that lays behind it. The navigable rivers that China now controls are one of the only ways to feasibly move a large invading army into the Outer Manchurian region. Now, of course, officially speaking, Russia has not given this land to China, because that might be a bridge too far, pun intended, for the Russian people to allow Vladimir Putin to stay in power. If the war in Ukraine has taught us anything, it's that Russians consider hanging onto their historical lands as a pretty big deal. And so Russian maps don't yet reflect this change in ownership, and they might not as long as Putin remains in power. After all, Putin doesn't want to lose his position, and China doesn't want him to lose his position either, as long as he's making major concessions to them without them having to do anything substantial in return. Getting stuff for free is always preferable to fighting for it, even if you are willing to fight. But all of this doesn't mean the change hasn't actually happened. Unlike Russian maps, official Chinese maps do reflect the change in ownership. But this isn't just a matter of disagreements on maps. China makes extreme claims on their maps all the time to throw around its weight, and usually their claims are baseless and very publicly rejected by their neighbors. For example, this is definitely the case with India, the Philippines, and Taiwan, just to name a few. But in the case of China's map claims on Russian territory, there's a lot more going on, and Russia has not thrown a huge public stink about China's claims to defend their territorial integrity. Instead, they've just tried to shove the whole thing under the rug and keep it out of the public eye. But there's one thing Putin could not hide, and that thing has caused some critics inside Russia itself to see right through the scheme and label this whole ordeal as a concession where the intention is to officially give China the territory at a future date. That description seems to be right on the money. You see, for years, this disputed island has been considered off-limits for development, since no one could decide who actually owned it. But now, Russia has conveniently reached an agreement with China to allow Chinese companies to develop the land, something that came after China officially claimed the entire island on their own maps. Russia had the chance to dispute China's new claims as part of these discussions, but ominously, they didn't. So Russia technically still claims half the island as far as their people at home are concerned. But to the rest of the world, China claims the whole island, and now China is developing the island for their own purposes. I think you get the picture here. But there's more. A lot more. On a similar theme, Russia has also been forced to give China shipping access on the river that runs along the length of the Russian border with North Korea. In this case, it's not so much a full-on territorial concession, as much as Russia being forced to give China a lease that, in the past, they have been extremely hesitant to give. The end result, though, is functionally equivalent to China claiming land from Russia, and rumors are that other such concessions could be on the near horizon, getting more drastic the longer the war in Ukraine goes on. So that's some of the territorial concessions, but what about the economic concessions? Well, arguably, those concessions have been even more damaging for Russia, because with economic concessions, China can get all the benefits of owning the majority of Russia's land, without the need for them to actually manage it or work on it. Russia does that for them. You might recall the Kremlin's war game scenario from before, where China took advantage of Russia's weak position against the West to demand massive concessions when it came to raw material imports, and then prepared for war when Russia said no. Russia wrote this war game back in 2014. That was 8 years ago, back before there were YouTube channels covering the war in Ukraine, and Russian bots in the comments section trying to brush them off as being mere propaganda. And now, 8 years after Russia predicted it would happen, right now, China really is demanding massive concessions when it comes to raw material imports. Let's get really specific. One example is the Power of Siberia 2 natural gas pipeline, a new pipeline that Russia is attempting to build to China to make up for its loss of the European market, which abandoned Russia after they invaded Ukraine. Russia is desperate to complete the Power of Siberia 2 project soon, seeing it as a necessary economic lifeline to keep the current regime afloat. In fact, Russia is so desperate that they began construction on their side of the pipeline before China had even agreed to complete its portion of the project on Chinese territory. That's like trying to bluff your opponent while they can see your entire hand. Chinese officials then responded to Russia's obvious desperation by doing what any profit-motivated business would do, making massive, even offensive demands to agree to make the pipeline happen. Earlier this year, China even went so far as to tell Russia that they would only agree to the completion of the pipeline if China received the same subsidized price for natural gas that Russian consumers pay. And if you don't understand what that means, the entire concept of a subsidy is that the government, in this case, the Russian government, pays a portion of the price of the product to make it cheaper for the end consumer. And usually, the one giving the subsidy is operating at a loss. Russia provides this low-price gas subsidy to its citizens as one of the rare benefits to them for being part of Russian society. But in the case of exports to China, this is a price so low that Russia would barely make a profit from the endeavor, and often even lose money due to the risks associated with the business model. This agreement would essentially turn Russia's energy industry into nothing more than a natural gas station for China, often operating at a loss, with China reaping all of the rewards. It's a pretty terrible outcome. So why would China think Russia would agree to such an awful deal in the first place? To be clear, Russia has not yet agreed to China's terms here, but they have made other major economic concessions in the same category, like selling oil to China at a 50% discount at the beginning of the war, basically making no profit, so that they could keep their energy infrastructure online during Western sanctions. Essentially, what China was asking for here was that Russia extend the same type of deal they had already gotten with oil to also include Russia's natural gas. Because, as it turns out, Russia needs energy buyers to keep their infrastructure online to avoid even more expensive long-term issues, and China is one of the only major buyers still available to them. But also, China probably thinks it can get Russia to agree to these extreme terms because this deal is still a better prospect for Russia than potential war. Less expensive too. And that is something to think about. Especially considering how Russia's own war games predicted that the outcome of refusing China's request would be China preparing for war. These concessions China is asking for, or rather demanding, are very real and very large. But China might be willing to go a whole lot further. Short of an invasion, there is still one other outcome we haven't discussed yet that is almost as bad for Russia, but not quite. And that's the idea that Russia could be forced to sell land to China to survive as a nation following their war with Ukraine. If it happened, this wouldn't be the first time Russia was forced to do this. Ever heard of Alaska? Russia had to sell it to the United States when they could no longer feasibly defend it, and found themselves in desperate need of cash following their loss in the Crimean War. Talk about déjà vu. And that's far from the only historical example in this category. In a similar fashion, Napoleon decided to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States in the early 1800s for a bargain price when France needed cash and was distracted by wars at home in Europe. Again, talk about déjà vu. They say that history doesn't repeat, but that it does rhyme. But honestly, this is starting to feel a whole lot closer to repetition. Highly relevant to the potential long-term future of Siberia, the reason there isn't a French empire in North America today is because France was forced to recognize that they could not feasibly hold their claimed territory that sat so far from Paris. After all, if the US ever wanted to, they could have theoretically crossed the Mississippi River and taken these lands from France, while the main French army would be thousands of miles away, occupied in Europe, and unable to respond. France figured it was better to get something from the US, rather than to risk getting nothing in the future, especially since they needed the cash so badly at the time. So they sold the United States a massive piece of territory, nearly twice the size of France, Germany, and the UK combined, for an extremely low price. But consider this. The distance from Paris to what was the Louisiana Territory is roughly the same distance as it is from Moscow to parts of modern-day Outer Manchuria, roughly 4,000 miles or 6,500 kilometers. Certainly, transportation methods have come a long way in the past 220 years, but this is still a very long distance we're talking about here. Just like France would have struggled to defend Louisiana across the Atlantic, Russia faces a similar problem with Outer Manchuria, with only one major highway connecting the region to the heart of Russia, making its defense a logistical nightmare for Russia's already strained military that is fully occupied in Ukraine, far to the west. By contrast, China has several major cities and extensive highway infrastructure leading right up to the Outer Manchurian border, with the largest military in the world full of well-rested, unoccupied soldiers. So it is not totally inconceivable that a post-Putin Russian administration might look at the current state of affairs and make the same decision Russia made in the past in regards to Alaska, opting to sell the Outer Manchurian territory rather than face the risk of perhaps having to defend it or lose it while getting nothing in return. Again, as we said at the beginning of this video, the mere possibility of an invasion can create real impacts, regardless of whether or not the invasion ever actually happens. And as with everything else in this video, there are strong historical precedents for that statement. This is especially true with a nation like Russia, who takes invasion threats very seriously, since they know all too well how all too willing they themselves were to invade their own neighbor when they thought they had the upper hand. We tend to read our own psychology into others, so this must make Russia very, very nervous when looking at China, even while we in the West may see it as an almost impossible scenario. This possibility might seem far-fetched, and it probably is. But it begins to seem more plausible when you consider the current state of Russia's finances. In a previous video, I laid out in extensive detail why, every day, it becomes harder and harder for Russia to financially recover from the war in Ukraine. This is because they are being forced to shut off more and more of their oil and gas infrastructure due to sanctions and a lack of buyers, which then creates expensive damage that must be fixed before that infrastructure can be turned back on. After the war ends, if Russia waits too long, they'll be faced with a chicken or egg problem, where they need to sell oil to raise funds, but they also need to raise funds to get enough money to fix the infrastructure that allows them to sell oil. Problem is, Russia probably won't have a whole lot of willing nations lining up to front them this money to fix the problem, given that with this war, they have alienated themselves from most of the international community. And let's be honest, Russia is now kind of a risky customer to lend several $billions to, even if you did really like them. China has already demonstrated that they're willing to play hardball with Russia when they sense desperation. So it's not unimaginable that Russia could find themselves in a place where their only option to remain a somewhat powerful international player was to sell some of their land back to China to help them restore their energy infrastructure. Let's be clear. This would cripple Russia in a massive way, as their major advantage on the world stage has always been the sheer size of their territory. And even worse, a concession of this sort would cause irreparable harm to Russia's international image for the next generation. But it would allow Russia to keep existing and to stay allied to China and save some face, which Russia might need after this war to avoid total geopolitical dominance by the West. In the past, when faced with such a decision, the vast majority of empires have decided to take the route of shame and self-preservation. So there's a good historical precedent for believing that Russia might do the same and sell their land. But even if none of this happens, the concessions Russia has already had to make to China have been devastating for their long term, and therefore, a Chinese invasion of Russia has already had its effect on geopolitics. Russia is a classic case of the mythical story of Icarus, the boy who flew too close to the sun thinking he was a god, and now, having gone too far, their wings are melted. The only thing left to see is how hard they actually fall. Incidentally, if you didn't know, that's why this channel is called the Icarus Project. We do a lot of work researching and documenting extensive details about modern dictatorships in an entertaining way, bringing to light information that very few people are aware of, so that everyone can watch the wings of the dictators melt. If you're interested in following how history shapes today's geopolitics and witnessing modern Icarus figures meet their fate, you can help support the channel by becoming a patron. To do that, just visit the link in the description of this video or scan the QR code on screen to find us on Patreon. No one knows exactly what the future holds, but it's sure to be an interesting ride, and we'll try to be there for as much of it as we can. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.